So I want to start today by asking you to hold two things in your mind at the same time, because the story I am about to tell you requires holding two things simultaneously that feel like they contradict each other, but that are both true and whose simultaneous truth is actually the most important thing to understand about what is happening with Linux right now, in this specific moment, in this specific year, in a way that I genuinely believe people are going to look back on as the inflection point, the before and after. The moment when the trajectory of Linux changed in a direction whose full implications were not visible to most people living through it, because the implications only become visible when you zoom out far enough to see the whole picture rather than the individual data points that the picture is assembled from. The first thing is that Linux is winning. Genuinely, measurably, historically winning in a way that the people who have been using Linux for 15 years and who remember when getting wireless drivers to work required 3 hours of forum research, and a ritual sacrifice would have found difficult to believe if you had described the current moment to them back then. Linux is winning, and the evidence for it is everywhere if you know where to look, in some places where you do not even have to look very hard. The second thing is that the Linux winning is not happening in the way that the Linux community spent 15 years imagining it would happen. And the gap between how it was supposed to happen and how it is actually happening is the gap where the story I want to tell you today lives. Because something big is happening with Linux, and it is not the something big that the Linux community was waiting for. And the difference between those two things matters enormously for what the winning actually means. Let me give you the winning first, because the winning is real, and it deserves to be acknowledged before we get into the complexity that complicates it. Steam on Linux, the Steam Deck. This is the most significant thing that has happened for Linux desktop adoption in the history of Linux. Desktop adoption, and I do not think that is hyperbole. Valve released the Steam Deck in February 2022, running SteamOS 3, which is an Arch Linux-based operating system using KDE Plasma, and they shipped it to millions of consumers who, in a significant portion of cases, had never used Linux before, who did not know they were using Linux, who just knew they were using a handheld gaming device that ran their games. The Steam Deck put Linux in the hands of people who would never have installed it voluntarily, and whose experience with it was the experience of a device that worked, that ran their games, that did not require command line knowledge to operate, and that introduced Linux as a platform to a population of users whose introduction to it through the Steam Deck is now the largest single cohort introduction to Linux as a consumer platform in the operating system's history. And the numbers follow the story. ProtonDB, which tracks game compatibility on Linux through the Proton compatibility layer that Valve has been developing since 2018, now shows gold or platinum ratings for the overwhelming majority of the Steam library's top-played games. The compatibility that people said was impossible, that people said would never be good enough, that people said was the permanent barrier to Linux. Gaming has been systematically demolished by Valve's investment in Proton, whose technical achievement is one of the most impressive pieces of software engineering in the open source world, and whose existence is a direct result of a corporation deciding that Linux gaming viability was worth the engineering investment that Valve committed to it. The server side has been Linux's for a long time, and the numbers just keep going in one direction. The majority of web servers run Linux, the majority of cloud infrastructure runs Linux, the majority of supercomputers run Linux. Android, which runs on the majority of the world's smartphones, is built on a Linux kernel. The embedded systems in your router, in your smart TV, in your car's infotainment system, in an enormous range of devices whose software you never think about, run Linux. Linux already won the infrastructure war so completely that the win has become invisible through its totality. And now something else is happening that has not gotten the attention it deserves, which is that the AI revolution that everyone is talking about is running on Linux in a way whose depth and exclusivity is remarkable even against the background of Linux's existing server dominance, the GPU clusters that train the large language models, the inference infrastructure that serves those models at scale, the development environments where AI researchers and engineers do their work, all of it running on Linux. CUDA, which is NVIDIA's parallel computing platform that most of the world's AI training runs on, is a Linux-first technology whose Windows support exists, but whose serious deployment is Linux deployment. The companies building the AI tools that are reshaping entire industries are building them on Linux. The infrastructure that the AI moment runs on is Linux infrastructure. If Linux's server dominance was the first wave of Linux winning, and the Android smartphone dominance was the second wave, the AI infrastructure dominance is the third wave, whose scale may exceed both of the previous ones. So Linux is winning. Big, undeniable, historically significant winning across gaming, server infrastructure, cloud computing, mobile, embedded systems, and now AI. This is the first thing you need to hold in your mind. Now here's the second thing. And this is where it gets complicated. The Linux that is winning is not the Linux that the Linux community built for the Linux community. It is not the Linux whose philosophical foundation was the user's right to understand, modify, and control their own computing environment. It is not the Linux whose governance model was the community of developers and users, whose collective ownership of the project was the thing that made it different from the corporate-controlled proprietary alternatives. The Linux that is winning is increasingly the Linux that corporations built for corporations, whose deployment serves corporate interests, whose governance is shaped by corporate contributors, and whose relationship to the foundational principles of the free software movement is increasingly complicated by the commercial context in which the winning is occurring. Let me be really specific about what I mean, because I do not want this to sound like vague philosophical concern. I want to give you the concrete things that are happening right now that paint the picture. The first concrete thing is what is happening with Microsoft and Linux and the WSL, Windows Subsystem for Linux. For those who are not familiar, WSL is a Microsoft technology that allows you to run a Linux environment inside Windows, to run Linux command line tools, to run Linux applications, to do Linux development work without leaving the Windows operating system. And it is genuinely impressive. The WSL2 version runs a real Linux kernel in a lightweight virtual machine, and the integration between the Windows host and the Linux guest is genuinely good in ways that previous attempts at this kind of integration were not. Developers who need Linux tools for their work can now get those tools without leaving Windows. That sounds like a win for Linux. More people using Linux tools, more developers familiar with Linux, more Linux in the world. But here's the reframe. Every developer who uses Linux through WSL is a developer who does not need to run Linux as their primary operating system. Every company that deploys WSL for their development teams is a company that does not need to migrate to Linux. Microsoft's investment in making Linux run really well inside Windows is an investment in making Linux a Windows feature rather than a Windows alternative. And the strategic intelligence of that investment, from Microsoft's perspective, is the intelligence of a company that learned from its history with Internet Explorer and with Azure that the way to win against an alternative is not to fight it, but to absorb it, to make it yours, to make using the alternative feel like using your product, rather than like choosing a competitor. WSL is Microsoft's most elegant strategic move against Linux desktop adoption. And the Linux community's response to it has been mostly to appreciate the technical quality of the implementation, rather than to examine the strategic context in which the implementation was made. The second concrete thing is what is happening with Canonical and Ubuntu's direction, and specifically with the Ubuntu Pro subscription service that Canonical launched, and has been progressively expanding in ways that are redefining the relationship between Ubuntu and the concept of a free operating system. Ubuntu Pro provides expanded security maintenance, compliance tools, and enterprise support features, and Canonical has been making Ubuntu Pro free for individual users up to 5 machines while positioning it as a paid service for enterprise deployments. This is a reasonable business model for a company that needs revenue to fund operating system development. But the specific mechanism through which Ubuntu Pro delivers its value involves attaching the Ubuntu installation to a Canonical account and registering the system with Canonical's infrastructure, creating the account-linked system registration model whose similarity to the account-linked operating system models of Windows and macOS is the similarity that the people who chose Ubuntu specifically to avoid that model are noticing and commenting on. The Ubuntu Advantage Tools package, which is the client software for Ubuntu Pro, was added to the default Ubuntu installation without the kind of prominent communication to users that a change which adds commercial service client software to the default system image warrants. The package prompts users to attach to Ubuntu Pro. The prompts appear in places that users do not expect commercial service advertising to appear, including in the terminal after running apt upgrade. The community's response to the prompts was strongly negative. Canonical adjusted the frequency and prominence of the prompts in response to the community feedback. But the fundamental situation remains, which is that Ubuntu's default installation now includes commercial service client software whose presence reflects Canonical's business interests rather than the user's computing needs, and whose presence in the default image of the world's most prominent Linux distribution for new users is the presence that shapes what millions of people's first experience of Linux looks like. The third concrete thing is what is happening with the Linux kernel's security architecture, and specifically with the ongoing work on restricting what kernel modules can be loaded and on the Rust in the Kernel initiative, both of which are genuinely important security improvements, but both of which are changing the relationship between the user and their kernel in ways whose implications for user control deserve more discussion than they are currently receiving. The move toward requiring kernel modules to be signed, which is the requirement that a kernel module must carry a cryptographic signature from a trusted authority before the kernel will load it, is a security improvement that prevents malicious or accidentally broken kernel modules from being loaded. But it is also a restriction on what you can run on your own hardware that creates the same category of dependency on signing authority infrastructure that the secure boot situation creates at the bootloader level. And whose progression, if it becomes the default model for kernel module loading, would mean that running custom or out-of-tree kernel modules, which is something that Linux users have always been able to do as an exercise of their control over their own systems, requires obtaining a signature from an authority whose willingness to sign your module is not guaranteed. The Rust in the Kernel initiative is a genuine technical improvement. Rust's memory safety properties address a category of kernel vulnerabilities whose exploitation in C code has been a persistent security problem, and the ability to write kernel drivers in Rust is a meaningful security advance. But the introduction of Rust as a kernel development language also changes the barrier to kernel contribution in ways that the community is still working through, because Rust is a more complex language than C in some respects, and because the existing kernel developer community's Rust knowledge is not uniform, creating the situation where some kernel developers have publicly expressed concerns about the pace and scope of the Rusty adoption and about whether the governance of the Rust integration has been as collaborative as changes of this scope to the kernel development process should be. And the fourth concrete thing, and this is the one I have been building toward because I think it is the biggest and the least discussed, is what is happening with the AI integration into the Linux development process itself. Not AI tools running on Linux, AI being used to write Linux. The Linux kernel development process has historically been one of the most rigorous code review processes in the software world. Patches are reviewed by subsystem maintainers. They are discussed on the kernel mailing lists. They go through multiple rounds of review before being accepted. The process is slow by design because the kernel runs on billions of devices, and the cost of a bug in the kernel is the cost paid by every one of those devices. The rigor of the process is a feature, not a bug. AI-generated code is now being submitted to the Linux kernel, not in large volumes yet, not as the primary mode of kernel development, but the submissions are happening, and the kernel maintainers are dealing with the review challenges that AI-generated code creates, which include code that looks syntactically correct and stylistically appropriate, but that contains subtle logical errors that the AI's pattern matching produced without the understanding that human code review is supposed to catch. Greg Croa Hartman, one of the most senior Linux kernel maintainers, has publicly commented on the problem of AI-generated kernel patches that waste maintainer review time by requiring the same careful review as human-written patches, while having a higher rate of subtle problems that make them ultimately unacceptable. The signal-to-noise ratio problem that AI-generated submissions create for the kernel review process is a problem whose scale will increase as AI code generation tools become more capable and more widely used by developers who submit patches without disclosing, or in some cases, without knowing that their code was primarily AI generated. Now I want to talk about what is actually happening right now in the news that connects all of these threads together, because I do not want this to be a purely abstract picture. I want to give you the current, happening now context. The announcement that Valve is working on SteamOS 3 becoming available for more hardware beyond the Steam Deck, the discussions about SteamOS as a potential general-purpose Linux distribution rather than a Steam Deck exclusive, represents one of the most significant potential shifts in the Linux desktop landscape in years. If Valve releases a version of SteamOS that any user can install on any PC with the polish and the hardware compatibility work and the gaming focus that Valve has invested in the Steam Deck version, the distribution landscape shifts in a way that none of the existing distributions can fully anticipate. Valve has resources that Canonical has. Valve has a user-based motivation that Red Hat does not. Valve has a specific use case that it is optimizing for, which is gaming, and its optimization for that use case has produced the most significant improvement in Linux gaming viability in the platform's history. The Framework laptop and its explicit Linux support commitment is another current development whose significance is hard to overstate for the trajectory of Linux hardware support. Framework ships laptops that are explicitly tested and supported on Linux, whose hardware is documented and whose firmware is open, and whose modular design philosophy aligns with the values of the Linux community in a way that most hardware vendors' designs do not. The fact that a hardware vendor is building a business around Linux compatibility as a feature rather than as an afterthought is the hardware market signal that the Linux community has been waiting for a long time, and whose arrival is genuinely meaningful. The European Commission's continued investment in open source software and specifically in Linux-based systems for government computing represents the geopolitical dimension of what is happening with Linux that does not get the coverage it deserves in the English language tech press. Germany, France, and other European countries have ongoing initiatives to migrate government computing to open source alternatives. The Munich project, which migrated city government computers to Linux and then migrated back to Windows, and whose back migration was widely cited as evidence that Linux was not ready for enterprise desktop use, has been revisited, and the current German government context is more favorable to open source adoption than it was during the Windows migration. The European Union's interest in technology sovereignty and not being dependent on American software vendors for critical government infrastructure is an interest whose practical expression includes Linux adoption at a scale whose visibility in the mainstream tech press is lower than its significance warrants. So here is what I think is actually happening with Linux when you put all of these threads together into the picture that they form. Linux is undergoing a bifurcation, not a clean split, not a formal fork, not an announced division, but a practical divergence between two versions of what Linux is that are increasingly serving different populations with different needs and that are being developed by different actors with different priorities. The first version is Enterprise and Infrastructure Linux, which is the Linux that the corporations are building, that the cloud runs on, that the AI runs on, that the government migrations are adopting, that the Steam Deck runs, that WSL integrates into Windows. This Linux is winning. Its winning is real, and its trajectory is toward more winning. But its governance is increasingly corporate. Its direction is increasingly shaped by the commercial interests of the companies whose engineering resources fund its development, and its relationship to the foundational free software principles is increasingly the relationship of a pragmatic tool rather than a philosophical commitment. The second version is Community Linux, which is the Linux that the individuals build, that Arch and Void and Alpine and Gentoo represent, that the developers who care about the foundational principles maintain and improve and keep alive because they believe in what Linux was supposed to be and refuse to let that version disappear into the corporate version, even as the corporate version gets the headlines and the hardware validation and the developer attention. This Linux is not winning in the metrics that the mainstream measures winning by. It is not shipping on hardware devices that millions of consumers buy. It is not being adopted by government agencies. It is not running on the GPU clusters that train the AI models. But it is alive, and it is maintained, and it is the version of Linux that the people who need Linux to be what it was supposed to be can still use. The big thing that is happening with Linux is the growing distance between these two versions, and the question of whether the Community Linux can maintain enough vitality to remain a real alternative as the resources, the attention, and the commercial gravity of the enterprise Linux world pull in a direction that Community Linux is not following. What should you actually do with this? Because I do not want to just leave you with the picture without the practical response. If you are using mainstream Ubuntu and the commercial direction bothers you, Linux Mint is still the most accessible transition that keeps you close to what Ubuntu was without what Ubuntu is becoming. Pop! OS from System 76 is another genuine option whose backing by a company that has been one of the most vocal advocates for the community's interests in the legislative fights we have talked about on this channel gives it a credibility that other Ubuntu derivatives do not have. If you want to understand what Community Linux actually is at its most genuine and you have the technical appetite for it, Arch Linux's rolling release model, its community maintained AUR, and its governance structure that is as close to the original Linux community model as any major distribution gets is worth the time investment whose return is the understanding of Linux as a platform rather than Linux as an appliance. If you are a developer and you want to be part of shaping what happens rather than just watching it happen, the kernel mailing lists are public, the distribution governance processes are open, the organizations doing the policy work, including the EFF, the Software Freedom Conservancy, and the FSF, are actively looking for people who understand what is at stake and who want to contribute to the fight for the community's interests in the decisions being made about Linux's direction. And please follow the people and organizations who are at the forefront of this. Follow Lunduk Journal, follow the EFF's coverage of open source policy, follow System 76's blog, whose CEO Carl Richel has been one of the most visible advocates for community interests in the legislative fights. Follow the kernel mailing lists if you can tolerate the volume. Follow Fedora's governance discussions. The information is public, and the picture it paints when you follow it consistently over time is the picture of something big happening with Linux in real time. Because something big is happening. And the people who understand what is happening, who can see both the winning and the complication of the winning, who can hold the genuine excitement of the Steam Deck and the AI infrastructure dominance, alongside the genuine concern about the corporate governance concentration and the community Linux vitality question, Those people are the people who can contribute to making sure that what Linux becomes, as it continues winning, is something worth winning as. That is the stakes. That is what is happening. And the conversation about it needs to be louder than it currently is. So share this. Talk about it. Get the people in your life who care about Linux, who care about open source, who care about the future of community-controlled computing, into the conversation that is happening right now about what that future looks like. Because the something big that is happening with Linux is not finished happening. And the outcome is not decided yet. And the people watching this video are exactly the people whose voice in the conversation can influence what the outcome is. So use it. Now is the time. While the big thing is still happening and the direction is still being decided, get in the conversation. Because Linux is at the inflection point, and inflection points do not wait.